After about 5 years or so at Dawson Springs and upgrading the factory and made some major changes there, we bought two large structural foam injection molding machines and began to produce large 30 and 40 pound parts, basically pallets for inter-company transportation for components for Ford and GM and so forth. Components such as transmissions and power steering units and so forth that are made in adjacent factories or subsidiary factories and required special palleting to deliver them to the assembly plants. So that was a good business. We were kept busy. Both machines were fully utilized. And then some other things. I introduced a new system to introduce colors into our products. We had colors that were required in our products, and we manually added the color concentrate to thousands of pounds of material every day, and it was a messy, haphazard business. So occasionally we used far too much color concentrate, which is pretty expensive, or we didn't use enough and the colors didn't match. So I introduced a system to automatically do that, and it eliminated about 6 people from the necessity of that operation. But I was constantly upgrading the tools. We had hundreds of different molds, and they were all old and needed refurbishing or upgrading. To run parts automatically, the mold has to eject the part, and the part has to fall or drop on a belt conveyor underneath the machine, and that's conveyed out then to wherever it's appropriate. The problem with the machines that we had, though, that they were relatively older machines, and the clearance under the machine was inadequate for the parts that we were making. And the molds themselves were not designed for automatic ejection. The clearance under the machines were hampered by a large, heavy fabricated steel base that tied the clamp end to the injection end, in addition to the 4 large tie bars that tied those two components together. Removed any possibility of dropping the parts below the tie rods onto a conveyor. But one day I was out looking at the situation, and I began to question the purpose of that large fabricated steel base, because it was really redundant with the tie rods. I called the machine company, Natco, and talked to them about it, but they wouldn't recommend any removal of that piece. We had a meeting there in the shop, and we talked about the potential. So we agreed to do one machine and try it. I had to go to Japan before we even started removing any pieces. And I was gone about 10 days. When I came back, they had removed them from all 21 machines. It was so successful and so reasonable to do that. And they had already gotten some conveyors and were running some parts that were capable of being ejected automatically. I was really shocked to see that, but it was a great improvement to our productivity. And of course, then I modified the machines with auxiliary ejection systems so that the large, deep parts that we made could be automatically ejected and dropped down through onto the conveyors. That system really created a big reduction in our manpower requirements, because then one person could run 2 machines very conveniently, much easier, less work than running one, because the parts came to them and all they had to do was package them. So, or do a subsequent operation, whatever was required, but that really reduced our manufacturing costs substantially. And of course, coupled with the endless changes I made to the tooling over those years, it really boosted that plant's productivity into the modern era. But that work began to taper off, and about this time we had a hostile takeover by another company. This other company owned a whole number of other plants, generally metalworking plants, and they decided to consolidate the engineering and other activities in the one location in Cincinnati, where our original headquarters were. So I was offered a job as a director of engineering for the whole company, which meant a transfer to Cincinnati. As I mentioned before, Shirley was not enamored with life in Dawson Springs, although she had pretty well settled in by this time. But when the announcement was made that I was going to be transferred to Cincinnati, well, it made her day. We looked for a house, but we couldn't find anything immediately that we liked or wanted to, we felt was suitable. So we moved into an apartment, and while we looked, my first discussion with my boss after we moved there was various projects that he wanted done, but the first one that was of greater interest to him was Weirton and its multitude of problems, and the fact that they were producing a light-duty shelving unit there that you normally bought at Walmart and so forth for $10 or $12 or whatever it was, but that they were about to lose the contract with Walmart unless they did something drastic about the quality of the product. And he wanted me to take a look at that whole thing and see what could be done to make it profitable and, of course, satisfy the customer's requirements. So he asked me to go over there and start there. I went over there, and of course I found the plant, and it was just a total mess. It was cheap, supposedly inexpensive to produce. Shelving units were costing a fortune to build, even though they were using scrap steel and sorting the scrap off of the delivery trucks by size and shape that they could use to make the various components of the shelving unit. All that labor and slow production methods and very crude tooling was destroying the profitability. In fact, I don't see that they were making any money at all with the system that they were using. So I reported back that there wasn't anything I could do to save that project the way it was, because the tooling and everything had to be replaced by modern techniques in order to get the costs down. One of the major complaints from the customer were the sharp, raggedy edges along the steel posts and braces and shelves that were being produced on this very cheap and ineffective tooling. So he asked me to put together a proposal on what to do and about how much it would cost. So I did that, and after it took me a few weeks to gather the information and decide on how the new unit was to look. And I came up with just about $1 million. So he approved it, and I began work on it from that standpoint. He had promised a delivery date to Walmart already without talking to me. It was enough time, but it was a very tight schedule. So I got started on it. First thing I did was look at the shelves and how I could improve the strength and reduce the weight, and of course eliminate the sharp edges. So I made several prototypes from high tensile 10,000 stick steel instead of the 30 or 40 that they were using. But this thin steel was tempered and hard, so instead of being soft and ductile. So combining the greater stiffness with a box-type tube along each long edge of the shelf, that I made a number of prototypes to develop that shape. I found that the prototypes had double the carrying capacity as the current pan-shaped shelf. It was considerably lighter, and you buy steel by the pound, so that there was a direct savings. I made a final drawing of what I wanted, and I ordered a 40-stand roll forming machine that would roll these edges on the fly. In other words, you fed the blank sheet in one end, and these dies were gradually changing the shape as the part passed through this long machine, which was 25, 30 feet long, at a rapid pace. And each stand had a little different shape on the die, so it progressively rolled the shape along the edges of this piece of steel and formed the tube or the rectangular shape that I wanted. And then, of course, I needed a punch press that would punch out the shape that I had to have to prepared before it went through this roll former. And I knew I needed about 75 or so sheets a minute in order to keep up with the production schedule that had been established. But we had a nice 300-ton punch press, but it only did 25 strokes a minute, which is way too slow. So I decided to buy a new punch press, and I decided on a Niagara brand because I was familiar with that from my years at GE, and I knew that they were good machines. So I got a purchase order written for $245,000, and I went up to Niagara Falls, New York, where the plant was. I wanted to go up there and talk to these people first before I placed an order with them. And it was an old plant. Niagara was an old name, and had been making machines. Well, I don't know when they started, but certainly before the war. And their facility looked like it too. But I went in there and I was talking to the sales manager or vice president or whatever he was, and the president came into the room. And the president of Niagara Press Company was short, and he had a pot gut that stuck out unbelievably, like a huge ball under his shirt. And the shirt that he had on, it was a white shirt, but it was buttoned down the front. It was a normal shirt, but he didn't have any underwear, any t-shirt or undergarment at all. And the tension on those buttonholes and buttons was such that it formed little openings between the buttonholes, and you could see the hair from his stomach sticking out through the cracks of his shirt. I'm not very fastidious, but that was pretty gross. It looked like he was ready to explode. But anyway, I was really negatively impacted, let's put it that way. But anyway, I told him I wanted to take a tour of the shop. I just out of curiosity, anyway. But I just wanted to see the shop. So we go out into the shop, and we were walking down this aisle, and they were heat treating the journals on fairly small crankshafts, probably 75 or 100-ton punch presses. They had a line set up. They were making those there, and each journal, or where the connecting rod fits, is a wear point, and it constantly turns, and the surface of those is hardened so that they last for years without any issues. And they're hardened by heating to a red hot certain temperature, maybe 1800 degrees or some such number, and then immediately quenched in cold water, and the surface then becomes very hard and wear resistant. It's a typical standard old-time ancient process. But the process they were using was clever enough. They had around each of the journals, and there were two of them on each crank. Well, actually there were three. Around each one of those journals was a clamshell that clamped around it that had heating elements in it. And when the crankshaft fit in the fixture, and these clamshells were mechanically activated, would come forward and close tightly around the area to be heated. And then a burst of high amperage electricity was applied, which immediately caused those journals to heat red hot. But it didn't take long. When the proper temperature was reached, these clamshells opened up and the crankshaft dropped into a tank of cold water. And then the quick chilling of the steel then made it very dense and hard. Well, the process was clever enough. It was a good process. However, I watched a few being done, and I noticed that the center journal was only getting red on the top side, and the clamshell on the bottom side apparently burned out, and it wasn't doing anything to the bottom side. And I told the president, I said, I think you've got a problem with this unit here. And he just looked at it, and it'll be all right. And he went on, and they continued making them. They were making them. They had numbers of them to make, which meant that the customer who got that crankshaft would certainly not get the life out of it that should have gotten by simply repairing that heater. I thought to myself, if that's this concern he shows about some very critical operation or somebody else, he's not going to worry about my quality either. I decided to cut the tour short, and I told him I had to leave. On the way back to Weirton, I began to think about this issue and what I could do to speed up the press that we had. I couldn't find any reason for not increasing the size of the motor and changing the pulleys on the machine and just speed it up. So when I got to Weirton, I looked it over and I could not find any logical reason not to do that, so I did it. I bought probably $5,000 or $6,000 motor and the appropriate pulleys and had maintenance to do the transferring, and gosh, that press just went to town. I mean, I didn't have any trouble getting 75 strokes a minute, and that's exactly what I needed. So I got these pre-painted steel coils from Japan and fed it through with an automatic feeder, and that press never stopped. It just a river of shelf blanks came out the back side of that press. And I had a conveyor set up that would, when 150 were stacked, I had a stacker back there. It would move them automatically for another 150 and then deliver them to the roll former where they were formed automatically then. So got the other parts all running well, and it was a real hit. We made those shelves very economically, and the quality of them was really so vastly improved. The marketing guys just loved them, and that process went day and night for I don't know how long. They eventually sold the plant and moved that to Florida, that system. So it may still be pounding them out down in Florida for all I know. As I mentioned, the schedule on that was pretty tight, and we were scheduled to begin production on a Monday morning, and I don't remember the date anymore, but the roll former was delivered on a Thursday before that, so that only gave me 2 or 3 days of breathing room. But I'd had a trial run at the plant in Michigan where that roll former was built that didn't really work as well as it should have. The parts didn't come out straight, but the blanks had someone shear and ship up there were not square, and so we blamed it on that issue there. We blamed it on the blanks that were not to specification. So I authorized shipment anyway. Well, we set the press up, I set the machine up and I got it running, and we began to run blanks through there that were made on the die and were actually very close to the tolerance. And they still came out crooked. But it was Friday night before we got the machine running. So we struggled with it all day Saturday. The vendors were there and they were adjusting the rollers with various changes in pressure on each one and so forth, but I still couldn't get the thing to work. And then, so we knocked off on Saturday night late. We came back in Sunday morning and just could not put our finger on the issue. And I was getting a little concerned, to say the least. But we kept doing whatever anybody could think of. We'd try that, and without any luck. And so Sunday afternoon passed, and evening came, and still no luck. And I'd given up hope of trying to make any parts for the scheduled crew that was due in Monday morning to start shipping these things. I don't know who suggested that we count the teeth on the chain drive system. Each roller had 2 sprockets that had supposedly 18 teeth on them, and they were all linked together with heavy-duty chains so that they all ran at the same speed. It was very important that they all run at the same speed. And so a bunch of us, we all crawled underneath that contraption and started counting the teeth on every one of those about a little short of 100 sprockets that we had to count accurately. And about halfway through, one of the guys said, well, there's only 17 teeth on this sprocket. And so we all gathered around and recounted a number of times, and that's all we could come up with. They were 1 tooth short. And somehow when the vendor of those sprockets shipped to the manufacturer of the machine, he got a 17 tooth sprocket mixed in with the 18s. And by this time it was about midnight Sunday. We were only hours away from production requirements. So one of the local engineers there knew the industrial supply house owner there in Weirton, West Virginia. So he got him out of bed, and the guy went to the shop, and he had a 18 tooth sprocket in his stock room, fortunately. One of the right size and thickness and so forth. And he brought it in, and we put it on, and boy, the parts just came out perfectly. So by 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning, we were cranking parts out by the hundreds. But that was a little too close for comfort. And when I finally added up all the bills, I came up with $985,000 and some change that I had spent on that project. So I made the budget with some surplus too. So I was really happy about that. And I guess the boss was too. He never said much, actually. He didn't say anything that I can recall, but I didn't care. As long as the thing came out the way I really worked hard on that one. I had some other machines made in conjunction with this roll former project, and I had those made at Moundsville, Kansas. I'd fly out to Kansas City, Kansas, and take a car 40 miles north to this little town situated in the middle of the flattest country in the world, without a hill in a million miles. In fact, the highest point in the whole region was the overpass on the interstate. It was an experience to go there. Moundsville is a little town. It had a couple of grain elevators there in town, and a pool room and a restaurant combination. And that was about it, other than some housing, of course. But boy, it sure was an isolated place. But the people there were very competent, and they did me a great job. One time my boss and I were headed for Pittsfield, Massachusetts for some reason. And when we landed at LaGuardia there in New York City, he was from Massachusetts, so he was practically raised in New York City. He knew every restaurant and so forth there. So when we landed, he said, "We're going to stay overnight here in New York City, and we're going to go to this French restaurant that I know." He said, "It's the best in town." So naturally, I didn't do a lot of arguing and resisting against that idea. We walked from our hotel to the restaurant. It wasn't far. I think it was somewhere around the theater district in 51st and something or other. I don't remember where, but I know that it had a canopy out over the sidewalk, and we had to go down some stairs into the sub-basement where the restaurant was. So we walk in, and it was a nice place. The waiters were in tuxes, and they had a little towel over their arm, and it was pricey. We were seated, and we ordered a drink, one of the more pricey ones, although there was no way to tell what the prices were because there weren't any prices on the menu. So I have no idea what that bill was that night, but it had to be a fairly large lump. But anyway, the waiter came, and he wanted to know if we were ready to order. So my boss, he was a great sport. He liked to have fun, and so he looks at the menu and he studies it, and he says, "Well, I think I'll have 3 prawn, 6 escargot, 4 oysters, and I think it was something else." It was all off the menu. There weren't any menus listing that kind of a mixture, but the waiter was nonplussed. He wrote down exactly what the customer wanted, and so Bob finished his order, and the waiter turned to me, and of course I just ordered right off the menu. I was going to try to top that one. And so the waiter turned to go back to the restaurant, or go back to the kitchen to place the order, and out of the corner of my eye I saw another waiter coming toward us and our waiter, and they stopped and had a word or two, and I heard what they were saying. They were French-speaking waiters, and I heard our waiter say, "J'ai un fou ici," And the other waiter started to laugh, and he asked, "Pourquoi?" I mean, questioning the reason for that analysis. Anyway, the waiter told him what. They had a little conversation there anyway, but when they were gone, my boss Bob was his name, asked me what were they saying, and I told him, and it made his day. he just started to laugh, and he had the best fun over that. And, anyway, it was an interesting meal, and we got exactly what we ordered. There wasn't any question or deviation from it. Afterwards, we went over to Radio City Music Hall and saw Damn Yankees with Rudy Valley. It was really a great show, and it ran for a long time. About a year passed, and rumors began to fly that we were headed for another hostile takeover. And it happened, and my boss was eased out of his job, and 3 lawyers from Dayton, Ohio, took over basically. And the first thing they did was take the pensions and reduce the insurance levels and increase the costs for that. And their whole style was to strip the company of its low-hanging fruit, at least. And they hired a guy from England to take over my old boss's job, and he was a nut. For example, he called a staff meeting in Cincinnati there, and he was located in Dayton, just an hour up the road, hardly more than that, if that much. And he hired a helicopter to bring him down to Cincinnati, and he gave us the most stupid speech that it was just absolutely ridiculous. In the meantime, the helicopter sat parked outside waiting for him, and when he was done, he went back to Dayton. And it was just, the place was really going down the tubes, that's for sure. And so I really became very disillusioned with the whole thing, and began to consider that perhaps we shouldn't buy a house there in Cincinnati, and that we'd better wait and see what the results turned out to be. So I waited and hoped that things would improve and the future would look better, but I decided not to take the chance on it, and made a decision to quit. So I began to look for a job, and I hired a headhunter, and began to take a look at other work. But I'll get into that later. I'm going to now talk about the overseas travels that I did for my company before I quit. And so with that, I think I'll end this particular video here. It's a little short, but I think in order to establish some continuity, I think I'll quit here. But I am going to start the next one with travels to Japan and my experiences in Japan buying the tools and and other equipment. So we'll jump back a little bit to my time in Dawson and also Cincinnati that included the time frame for these travels. So we'll go to the next one now.